Starting in Mark chapter 3, going to go through verses 1 through 12. It says, Another time he went into the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal on the Sabbath. Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, Stand up in front of everyone. Then Jesus asked them which is lawful on the Sabbath to do, good or evil, to save a life or to kill. But they remained silent. He looked around at them in anger and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts and said to the man, Stretch out your hands. He stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. Then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus. Jesus withdrew with his disciples to the lake, and a large crowd from Galilee followed. And when they heard all that he was doing, many people came to him from Judea, Jerusalem, Idumea, and the regions across Jordan, and Tyre and Sidon. Because of the crowd, he had his disciples to have a small boat ready for him to keep the people from crowding him. For he had healed many, so that those with diseases were pushing forward to touch him. Whenever the evil spirits saw him, they fell down before him and cried out, You are the Son of God. But he gave them strict orders not to tell who he was. So Mark 3 starts with the story of a man with a shriveled hand. And Mark's account is 6 verses long, and the Gospel of Matthew is 6 verses as well. But it has a completely different details that add kind of further background to this story. So if you want to turn to Matthew 12:19 through 14, I'll read what it says. It says, Going on from that place, he went into their synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, they asked him, Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? He said to them, If any of you has a sheep and it falls into the pit on the Sabbath, will you not take hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable is a man than a sheep? Therefore it is lawful to do good on a Sabbath. Then he said to the man, Stretch out your hand. So he stretched it out, and it was completely restored, just as sound as the other. But the Pharisees went out, and they plotted how they might kill Jesus. If now we take and put Matthew and Mark's accounts together, it doesn't change the meaning behind the text, but it gives us kind of a clearer insight into what happened and the full details. Now, this is my version and my version only of kind of what the story may look like. And it goes like this. Going on from that place, he went into their synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. And looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, they asked him, Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? And he said to them, If any of you has a sheep and it falls into the pit on the Sabbath, will you not take hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable is a man than a sheep? Therefore, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Now, to be clear, there's no conflicting accounts between Mark and Matthew or even Luke. They all line up on Jesus' ultimate point of what is lawful on the Sabbath. The difference in Matthew and Mark may simply be that the author's perspective on the events. We also have to remember that Mark's gospel came from Peter and his teachings. Therefore, Peter may not have lined up the grain field with the healing of the man when he spoke, and therefore Mark did not make the connection in his writings. So looking at some specifics on this text, verse 3, Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, Stand up in front of everyone. This is obviously not a private miracle. Jesus wanted the room to be aware of this man's case. Jesus was not doing this to win the people or to gain fame for himself. Jesus' goal was to prove who he was and his authority to tell what was lawful on the Sabbath and what was not. Now Jesus must have known the thoughts of the Pharisees in his mind as he asked them in verse 4, which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, or to save a life or to kill. And the Pharisees remained silent. David Guzik points out in his commentary that according to their Sabbath traditions, if you cut your finger on the Sabbath, you could stop it from bleeding, but you could not put ointment on it on the cut. You could stop it from getting worse, but you were not allowed to make it better. And so the question that Jesus asked is obvious, and it speaks directly to the heart of good and evil. Think about it this way. Healing the man's hand is good, but it makes it evil to do it, but does it make it evil to do it on the Sabbath? That's what the religious leaders believe. They are taking good things and making them evil because it breaks their traditions. So turn to Isaiah 58, 6 through 14. This is a long text, but I want you to follow along with me and keep in mind that this is God's answer to their fast, but spiritually it's the same application as the fasting from work on a Sabbath day. Is it not the kind of fasting I have chosen, to loosen the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and break every yoke? Is it not to share your food with the hungry and to provide the poor wanderer with shelter? When you see the naked, clothe them, and do not turn away from your own flesh and blood. Then your light will break forth like a dawn, and the healing will quickly appear. And then your righteousness will go before you, and the glory of the Lord will be your rear guard. Then you will call on the Lord, and he will answer you, and you will cry for help, and he will say, Here I am. If you do away with the yoke of oppression, with the pointing of finger and the malicious talk, and if you spend yourselves on behalf of the hungry and satisfy the needs of the oppressed, then your light will rise in the darkness, and your night will become like noonday. The Lord will guide you always, and he will satisfy your needs in the sun-scorched land, and will strengthen your faith. You will be like a well-watered garden whose waters never fail. Your people will rebuild the ancient ruins and will raise up the age-old foundations. You will be called the repairer of broken walls, the restorer of streets of dwellings. If you keep your feet from breaking the Sabbath and doing as you please on the holy day, if you keep your Sabbath a delight and the Lord's holy day honorable, and if you honor it by going your own way and not doing as you please or speaking idle words, then you will find joy in the Lord, and I will cause you to ride in triumph on heights of the land and to feast on the inheritance of your father Jacob, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. Now, the fasting is a setting aside of food, but it can also be things as a way of dedicating yourself to the Lord. Um, Fasting can be many things, such as cell phones, technology, candy, coffee, things like that. But the truth about fasting is that it's a time to dedicate yourself to the Lord in humility, and it is a private time. It's a time to kind of take your focus off yourself and put your focus on God. And that's the heart of what God is saying. He's saying to the people that it is a time to loose the chains of injustice, to untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free, and to break every yoke, to share your food with the hungry, to provide the poor wanderer with shelter, and then when you see the naked, to clothe them and not to turn away from your own flesh and blood. And what this list ultimately does is it takes our focus off of ourself and our selfishness, and it shows the heart of God. And that's what fasting is for, is to take our minds off ourselves. And so what God is speaking through this prophet Isaiah is he's telling the people, instead of focusing on what you're not doing and not going to do the right things. And this applies to Jesus' debate with the religious leaders over what is lawful on the Sabbath. It is never about what you're not supposed to do, but instead about the things he calls you to do. To put it simply, in terms of the Sabbath, God is less concerned with what might be considered work and more about what God, the people, should be doing. And this links us back to Jesus' question, which is lawful on the Sabbath? To do good or to do evil, to save a life or to kill? To do good and save a life, or to leave them struggling and potentially dead? Now, Charles Erdman, he wrote about Jesus' statement. He said, what Jesus states is this: to refuse to help is harm. To decline to rescue a life is murder. When therefore one fails to show mercy on the Sabbath day, he is guilty of the most extreme lawlessness and of the most unpardonable desecration. The Sabbath law does require rest from labor, but that law must yield to the law of love. Work must be avoided on the Sabbath, if possible, but works of mercy are not only innocent, but their voluntary refusal is sinful. Looking at verse 5, we see, he looked around at them in anger and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, and he said to the man, stretch out your hand. And his hand was completely restored. Now, Jesus was angry and distressed at their sin and their self-righteousness. And it's interesting to point out that we never see Jesus angry at sinners and tax collectors, only at the religious leaders. Now, the healing of this man was, of course, instantaneous, quick, and it was public. In verse 6, we see that then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus. So the Herodians were a Jewish group who supported the policies of Herod Antipas, and they supported Rome. And it was likely they had rejected the messianic hopes, and that's why they have worked ultimately with the Pharisees to try to entrap Jesus in executing. It's also noted that the Herodians, like the Pharisees, wanted to keep the status quo and may have had an interest in eliminating Jesus so as to not cause political unrest. Now, political uprisings were nothing new, and like I said, it's ultimately kind of one of those of the Pharisees may have wanted to get with the Herodians on keeping a political uprising from happening if they believe that's kind of what's going on. And so in the book of Acts, we see that Peter and the disciples are persecuted after having healed many. They were put in jail, and then an angel of the Lord let them out and told them to go tell the people of this new life. The guards then brought the men before the Sanhedrin privately because they thought that the people would ultimately stone the religious leaders. And these men were questioned and they answered by honoring God. Response to these men. So if you will turn to Acts 5:33 through 39. And it says, a teacher of the law who was honored by all the people stood up in the Sanhedrin and ordered that these men be put outside for a little while. Then he addressed them, men of Israel, consider carefully what you intend to do to these men. Some time ago, Thaddeus appeared claiming to be somebody, and about 400 men rallied to him. He was killed and his followers were dispersed, and it all came to nothing. And then after him, Judas the Galilean appeared in the days of the census and led a band in revolt. He too was killed, and all his followers were scattered. Therefore, in this present case, I advise you, leave these men alone. Let them go, for if their purpose or activity is of human origin, it will fail. But if it is from God, you will not be able to stop these men, and you will only find yourselves fighting against God. So what I want you to see is that there was Thaddeus who rallied 400 men to him, and he was killed, and the people scattered. Judas, not Iscariot, or Jesus' brother, led a revolt, and when killed, the people also disbanded. So it is very likely that in this same attitude is driving the hostility towards Jesus, and they know that if they can find a way to kill him, even if it may not be publicly, his followers would likely be disbanded, and their problems will kind of be over. So looking on in verse 7, we see where Jesus withdrew from his disciples to the lake, and a large crowd came from Galilee and followed. There's no doubt that this was the Sea of Galilee, and interestingly enough, Jesus does the same thing after healing the paralytic and in the conflict with the teachers of the law. So Jesus may have used this time by the lake as a retreat away from the crowded and dusty inland cities. It could also be a time of retreat away from the religious leaders and the teachers. He may well be doing this to try to keep away from the religious leaders so as to not further provoke them before his time. Verse 8 says, when they all heard what he was doing, many people came from Judea, Jerusalem, Idumea, and the regions across the Jordan and around Tyre and Sidon. And so Jesus' fame had been spreading far and wide. Judea would have been a region to the south. This region is where Jerusalem was. Jerusalem was roughly 85 miles from Capernaum. Idiom was south of Jerusalem around the Dead Sea and the lower half of the Judean region. Tyre and Sidon were to the northwest of the Sea of Galilee. And all this to say that the people traveled up to 100 to maybe 120 miles to see Jesus. At an average of 3 miles per hour, if you did that 12 hours a day, that's 36 miles a day. That means the people would have traveled 3.5 to 4 days on foot to see Jesus. And just as a side note, what does that say about us who can't get motivated to make it a 10 or 20 minute ride to church? So one more point I see on verse 8 though is that I do think that it can help us to explain verse 6. Because as the people came to see and be healed by Jesus, it's very likely that it made the religious leaders and the Herodians very uncomfortable. They would have not been wanting to look like to Rome and government that there was a political uprising happening. So in verse 9 again we see because of the crowd, he told the disciples to have a small boat ready for him and to keep the people from crowding around him. So this verse seems insignificant until you realize who it is that asked for the boat to be made ready. It's Jesus. He is fully God, fully human, and yet we see his need for preparation. We're not told if Jesus ever uses the boat, but he simply asked that it be made ready if the need arose. And there's a lesson on preparation that can be drawn from this verse. Think of it like this. What if I came in here having not studied or even had read the text? I know it may seem like I don't, but I promise I do read the text. Or what about a worship leader that comes in the church coming on Sunday morning, not looking at or even knowing the songs and the environment he'll be leading in? Even in the life of a believer, there are preparations to be made and things that must be done. Saving for retirement, buying health and property insurance, and going to the doctor. All of these things have to be done in the life of a leader. Even if you have complete faith in God, there's still preparations to be made. So verse 10, for he had healed so many that those with diseases were pushing forward to touch him. I think it's interesting that the text says they only wanted to touch him so that they could be healed. Some questions we can ask is, do they want anything else from Jesus, his words, forgiveness, or simply just to be healed and go on their way? We can also ask, were all those who touched him actually healed? And the text does not necessarily specify this. In Mark 5:25 through 31, we have the story of a woman who went through the crowds to touch Jesus. And we'll look at this story more in depth later, but listen to it, and I want to pull out a couple of things from it. It says, a large crowd followed and pressed around him, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She then had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors, and had spent all she had. Yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. And when she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd, touched his cloak, and immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. And at once Jesus realized the power that had gone out from him, and he turned around in the crowd and asked, who touched me? Who touched my clothes? You see the people crowding around you, his disciples answered, and yet you can ask, who touched me? So a couple things we can bring out from this story is that the people were there and were crowding around Jesus and pressing up against him, yet we're not told of any healings or anything else happening to them. And also we can see that she touched his cloak, and Jesus immediately knew it had happened, even with the others touching him. So back in our verses in Mark 3, were all those people healed? If I have to give an answer, I'm saying yes and no. Even today we see that not all who come to Jesus are healed. So verses 11 and 12. Whenever the evil spirits saw him, they fell down before him and cried out, you are the Son of God. But he gave them strict orders not to tell who he was. So it may well be that Jesus would not let them tell who he was for a couple of different reasons. One being Jesus knowing that they were accusing him of working with Satan, and we'll see that next week. He may not have wanted the people and the religious leaders to think they were together, Jesus and Satan. Number two could also be that he did not want the people to get the wrong idea of him as Messiah. He wanted the people to understand ultimately his journey and his death and the forgiveness of their sins, and not be seen as a miracle working Messiah who was coming as an earthly leader to restore Israel.